you are all here. We have a group of people that are really quite diverse. We have folks who are clinicians, scientists, sufferers, family members, you name it. There are people who care for one reason or another about misophonia here. For those of you who don't know me, I am Zach Rosenthal. I direct the Duke Center for Misophonia and Emotion Regulation. I'll just call that CMER, C-M-E-R. I'll probably call that CMER the rest of the way since it's a mouthful to say the whole title. We are really excited today to have Dr. Sylvie Raver, and she is going to be joining us to spend some time talking about 2022, a year in review of misophonia, primarily from a research perspective. I'm going to kind of share the spotlight with Dr. Raver and talk some about my own thoughts and my own reflections on this past year, which I will tell you up front, I think this really was the most important year for misophonia. And I'll explain to you all why I think that's the case. Before we jump in, let me just say a couple of housekeeping things. One is that we've done these webinars a bunch, and we've learned a few things. And one of the things we know is that if everybody could respectfully and kindly keep your sound muted, that would be wonderful. If by accident you have yourself unmuted, we will try to mute you as quickly as we can, just to minimize distractions. Also, all of us as presenters are mindful of trying not to make any triggering sounds or evoke any kinds of triggers for anyone. We live in the world of misophonia. We're really quite sensitive to all of that. So we'll do our best, and we hope that works well for you guys. We are recording this. We are going to post this on a YouTube channel, and we will send the link to everybody who registered. So if you are not with us now and you are watching this later on YouTube, welcome to you. Welcome to you as well. So we are going to now go ahead and get ourselves started. Emily's driving with the slides. So Emily, if you wouldn't mind clicking to the next slide. This is our team, and again, just a welcome from Duke, from our group. If anybody has any questions or comments or really anything you want to communicate with me directly about, you can see my email there in the lower right. You please feel free to call me Zach instead of Dr. Rosenthal. My first name is Mark. That's why it's listed as mark.rosenthal, but everybody should feel free to just informally call me Zach. Next slide, please, Emily. Thank you. A couple of brief acknowledgements in getting ourselves going. I want to first acknowledge our longtime partner and collaborator and friend, Dr. Jennifer Brout, who, as many of you probably know, is the leader of the International Misophonia Research Network. And Dr. Brout is here with us today as well. She is going to be moderating the Zoom chat. If you have questions as we go through today, please feel free to ask them at any point in the Zoom, and Dr. Brout will do her best to answer some of those questions. At the end of time, we'll have some time allocated for us to do some Q&A, and Dr. Brout will help moderate the questions that you all ask. She will moderate them for Dr. Raver and I. I'd also like to acknowledge Chris Edwards and SoQuiet.org. Chris is here with us tonight. He is the director of SoQuiet. If you don't know about SoQuiet, SoQuiet is a relatively new misophonia nonprofit. It is an advocacy group that Chris is a part of, and I am also a part of as a member of the board. And this is the website here, and it's something for anybody who's interested in getting involved in the world of misophonia advocacy. This is a really great place to start, and please visit SoQuiet.org. Emily, thank you. I want to acknowledge Emily for making most of the slides. Most of the things I'm going to talk about are really the product of Emily's fine work. So thank you, Emily, for your work in getting us set for today and for organizing. And Lisa Kelly, who's our longtime leader of research in our program, she also has helped prepare our slides tonight. Our whole CMER team, all of the anonymous families who have generously supported our work at Duke and our center, and all of you as advocates supporting research, education, and treatment of misophonia in whichever way that you are doing. Thank you to everyone. So this is the plan here. We've just done the first part, which is to welcome you. Dr. Raver will go next, talking for about 10 minutes to 15 minutes about scientific activities and research advances, really with a spotlight on the Misophonia Research Fund. And then I'm going to talk about scientific discoveries, advocacy, and awareness in 2022. And I'll end my slides by giving you what I think are the top 10 advancements for misophonia in the year of 2022. And as I said before, we'll then move to some Q&A. Dr. Raver, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Zach. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everybody, for making the time to join us today. I'm just honored to be a part of this conversation. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the Misophonia Research Fund, which is a philanthropic initiative exclusively dedicated to funding rigorous and impactful misophonia research to help people who are suffering from the disorder. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that fund came to be, how it's operated, and what it's really supported in the past few years and what we've seen coming out of the fund in 2022. As Zach said, we really believe that this has been just an incredible year in progress for the field, and we're excited to share a little bit about the fund's efforts in advancing that. So Emily, next slide, please. To orient you first, though, I'm not an employee of the Misophonia Research Fund. I work with an organization called the Milken Institute Center for Strategic Philanthropy. And that means that I'm advise the fund and have helped kind of set it up and help work with it. But I'm an employee of the Milken Institute. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. And the center that I work in is filled with mostly scientists who really work using the levers and the tools of philanthropy and private foundation money to advance scientific priorities. So we do this in a variety of ways. They're all here on the slides, but really we take our scientific training and we work as sort of liaisons between members of the scientific community and members of the community that are affected by a disease with funders who are interested in supporting research, but don't really know how to get started or how to identify where funding should go in a field, what the real challenges are. And then we also help provide leadership to stand up and execute funding programs. And the Misophonia Research Fund is a great example of that work that I'm going to tell you about in just a second. Next slide, please. So starting in 2018, a private family foundation in Chicago called the Ream Foundation started working with our center to understand more about the field of misophonia. They had personal experience with it. They were really dedicated to improving the outlook for people who are suffering and their families. And they first needed to start by understanding what the field needed. And that's why our team was so helpful at that particular point. So we analyzed by speaking with a lot of different people who were suffering from misophonia, studying misophonia, treating people with misophonia. We really understood what the challenges were facing the field and why progress was seemingly stalled and awareness was really low for people who are experiencing the disorder. So the team identified some structural barriers. As everybody here probably knows, misophonia is complex and it is experienced through a bunch of different systems that influence audiology, psychology, psychiatry, pediatrics. A lot of different disciplines touch misophonia, and those disciplines weren't speaking to each other. And so that was the first issue, that everything was pretty fragmented, and this was creating a problem that was leading to scientific barriers. What are some of the core scientific barriers in the middle of this slide? Misophonia was not understood and largely uncharacterized. There was no agreed upon way to reliably diagnose or measure the condition. And because of that, the toolbox of effective therapeutic strategies really wasn't available. There was no strategy around this. Because of those core scientific barriers, the prevalence of the condition, of the disorder, were not known. There are some good estimates, but it really wasn't rigorously studied. The impact, I think people can feel on an individual level, but collectively, population-wise, that wasn't known either. And most importantly, physician and public awareness are really low. I think everybody here has experienced describing misophonia to someone and the person on the other end of that conversation saying, oh, I know what that is, but they didn't know that there was a name for it. So that's a first challenge. And all of this is intertwined with the fact that there had been no funding dedicated to misophonia research. It was a severely underfunded field. So that brought us to the next slide, which was the establishment of the Misophonia Research Fund, which the goal is right there to advance breakthroughs and to end suffering. And this fund is laser focused on supporting research projects from rigorous scientists all throughout the world to do just that. Next slide, please, Emily. So the Misophonia Research Fund is focused on 4 broad scientific priorities, and I won't spend a lot of time on these, but these speak to the challenges that the team initially identified as being really what was underlying the lack of progress in the field. And so since 2018, when the initial barriers were identified, and 2019, when the fund was established, the fund has been committed to driving progress across these 4 strategic priorities, and that's continued to drive our field forward as we go. Can I have the next slide, please? The Misophonia Research Fund, the MRF, does that through 3 primary activities. Each year there is an open annual grant program. It is open to anyone with the right credentials, the eligibility of being a rigorous scientist with a doctoral degree at an academic institution or a nonprofit organization. Anybody with a great idea and the resources to do it can apply, and that's really important to make sure that the community of researchers is that we're growing it each year, that we're broadening it, and that it's important that the global request for proposals goes out to everybody. There's an annual convening that we host every year to bring the community together, to share knowledge, to learn from each other, and to develop together. Most people who study misophonia are the only person in their department or institution who do that, and it's really important to make connections across researchers, and we've seen a lot of collaborations coming out of this. And the last thing is to support the development of consensus language around what misophonia is. If we can't agree on what it is, then we can't study it well. We can't compare findings across studies. We can't develop tools that reliably and rigorously measure and assess the condition. And these have been the real pillars of activities for the Misophonia Research Fund that support those scientific priorities. And the next slide, please. We're guided by an expert scientific advisory board. This is the roster in 2022. Zach Rosenthal is one of them. The rest of the folks are from all over the US and around the world. And it's really a great group of people who guide the strategic priorities of the fund, help advise on the tactics and really what kind of science is coming out and how the fund is continuing to support the scientists in the ways that they need. Next slide, please. So stepping back of a bird's eye view of this multi-year research program, since March of 2018, when we started through where we're going in September of 2023, like I said, we're just focused exclusively on misophonia and putting money into the field. And across 4 funding cycles that have previously been committed, the Misophonia Research Fund has committed about $10 million to the field. And that's major for a field that has had no dedicated funding source of that magnitude already. So right here, you can see 4 cycles of funded investigators. If you go to misophoniaresearchfund.org, you can learn more about each of the projects. You can sign up for research studies because it links out to the investigators' websites. You can watch videos of them describing their research in ways that are really accessible and easy to understand. And you can see the publications that are coming out. And that's really important to make sure that you can read everything that the fund is supporting. Next slide, please. So this is just going to be a quick animation of all of the different labs that are currently supported by the Misophonia Research Fund. 4 cycles of funding. We've now funded 26 people. And that has a downstream effect. When a principal investigator is funded, they support a whole lab. And so it exposes misophonia research to more scientists, to young trainees, to people who are not originally in the field. It brings more people into the field so that we're increasing the pool of talent within the scientific community who is supported by this research and is focused on misophonia. And that's really important to growing the future of the field. Next slide, please. So just a screenshot of what we've seen so far. If you go to PubMed, the sort of library of where scientific publications are collected in the US, you can find 118 publications with misophonia as the topic. We've confirmed that that's the topic as of this December, and more than half of those folks have touched the Misophonia Research Fund, and we're really excited about that. And this shows that it's just having a really broad reach within the field, and there's still a lot of room to go. So there are more people to bring into the Misophonia Research Fund community, and that's an area of opportunity for us. Next slide, please.
So, Sylvie, can I ask a question
Please.
before you advance? Just for everybody who's looking at this slide, where it says 66 articles, can you just describe since we have kind of
Absolutely.
a mixed audience, what that means when you say articles. What is 66 articles?
Thank you, Zach. So that's a study. That's usually a study, a research study that describes an experiment. It may test a hypothesis, an idea that a scientist has. It tends to describe its methods in good, rigorous detail. It describes its results, and it has made it through the peer review process, which is the best that the scientific field has, where peers of other scientists evaluate the science and decide that it's ready for publication and that it really should go out into the canon of knowledge. The other is case reports, and those are just describing smaller numbers. They don't really test a hypothesis. They're important because they add to the body of knowledge of what misophonia is. But over time, we're seeing more experimental research, and that's kind of what you want to see as a field matures. Next slide, please. So this, I might ask Emily to go to the next one, because this actually shows a good animation. You can see right here, starting in 2011, all the way through 2022, this is the number of publications and the number of papers of scientific articles that are coming onto PubMed. And the progress is just staggering. It's so exciting to see this level of enthusiasm and generation of new knowledge coming into this community, because this is going to translate to the foundation of research that underlies treatments and underlies therapeutics and underlies all of this necessary work that's coming down the pipeline for people who are suffering. And so you really need to see a foundation of rigorous research, and that's what we're starting to see. And we're excited to sort of see the upward trajectory that has come since the Misophonia Research Fund initiated in 2019. Next slide, please. So this is the last thing that I'll talk about, and I know Zach's going to talk about this a little bit more. And if you want to read more, there's lots of resources already out there about this consensus definition, but this has been something that we felt was very important from the beginning of the Misophonia Research Fund, and that was to align the scientific community around what is misophonia and how do you define it. And we went through a really long, detailed process to do this, and the results were published in March of this year for everybody to read. You don't have to subscribe to anything in order to read the paper. And it's a consensus definition of misophonia. It's been viewed thousands of times and downloaded by other scientists many times, which is very exciting for us because that starts building the knowledge base within the community around what misophonia is. And people can challenge the definition. That's very important. Language evolves over time. Our concept of a disorder or a medical condition evolves over time. And so we encourage everybody to read this and think about it, and share with within the community, what is it missing? What should it have in the next revision? It's really important that this definition is living and grows and reflects the experience of people living with misophonia and reflects the new knowledge that is continuing to accumulate every day that Zach's going to tell us about next. So that's all I have. If you ever want to reach out and learn more, again, misophoniaresearchfund.org. To learn all about the research that's being supported right now. And we're so excited to see what happens next.
Thank you, Sylvie. Very, very exciting. You can kind of see a preview of why I think 2022 was so important. If you dial back, Emily, if you don't mind, go back 2 slides just for, yeah, right there. You can already see kind of where I'm going to take us in a few minutes. Look at that graph. It's really, it's really, really exciting when you think about, from a scientific perspective, just how much more work is coming out in the last 2 years in particular, and this last year especially. So this is really exciting. And again, the Ream Foundation Misophonia Research Fund, through partnership with Milken, as Sylvie talked about, these folks are just incredibly generous and incredibly helpful. They're really responsible for catalyzing knowledge and really generating knowledge about misophonia. So really exciting time. And thanks again, Sylvie, for sharing for everybody a little bit about kind of what the mission is and what's happened so far. All right, Emily, let's move on. Okay, so let's talk now about some scientific discoveries in this last year. And let's go to the slide next. So one of the things that happened in this last year scientifically is that the first ever special section on misophonia in any scientific journal was published. And this is the journal called Frontiers in Neuroscience. It's the same journal that the consensus definition was published in that Sylvia was just sharing with us. The title of the special section is listed here. It's Advances in Understanding the Nature and Features of Misophonia. And if you're unfamiliar with what a special section is, this is basically just a collection of articles that are curated about a particular topic. And they're curated using the standard peer review process. But it's just a way to kind of get a big bolus of information about one topic and kind of put it all together in one fell swoop. And I'm a co-editor on this along with two other colleagues, and just really been excited to pull these articles together. And we're almost done. We have I think one or two more that are just at the very end of the process that we hope will be published very, very soon. But thus far, you can see listed here in the bullets, there is a really, and the way to think about this special section is that we begin with the consensus definition. That's really the centerpiece of this if you're wanting to go and look this up. And by the way, if this is kind of scaring you a little bit because it sounds kind of academic or sciencey, I'll make it really simple. All you have to do is go to Google, go to that Google machine of yours, right? And type in Scholar. Type in Scholar in the box and hit enter. And what you get when you go to Google Scholar is now you're in the back-end database of all scientific studies that have ever been published on anything. And so you don't actually have to go to PubMed or have access to an academic library or anything. You can just go to Google Scholar and you can type in Advances in Understanding the Nature and Features of Misophonia, and you will find the special section pretty quickly. You'll see that the consensus definition is listed there. You also will see a brief report, an opinion piece. Dr. Brout, who's with us, provided an excellent kind of commentary to provide a seed for an academic discussion and discussion in the lay public about the consensus definition. There's a couple of review papers in there that kind of characterize some piece of what misophonia might be or how we can study it, how we can provide help for people with misophonia. And most of what's in this special section, 17 of these papers, are original research studies. And I can tell you the trailing last couple ones that are in there, one of them is a research study and the other is a kind of a review paper. You can see the number of views that have hit this special section, and you can see the countries where most people are clicking from. So this is exciting. Go to this. I mean, this is all accessible. It's free. You can take a look. You can send questions to me or to anyone on my team, and we'll be happy to answer questions about any of these studies. Okay, so this is a really exciting thing from 2022, and let's look at it a little bit more closely next. These next few slides are not intended to be deep dives on all of these particular studies. Okay, Emily, can you mute whoever is unmuted? If you wouldn't mind, if you could keep yourself muted. And Emily, or Lisa, if you could just kind of help people out with that if they need help. So these next couple slides, as I was saying, these are really kind of just showing you visually the titles of all of the papers in the special section. I'm not going to get into details of each of them. We don't have time to do that. It's just to kind of give you a visual so you can see what is being published in this last year. The consensus definition, the commentary. You can see there's a study here on kind of a preliminary self-report measurement tool for misophonia in adolescents. There's just an absolute lack of research on misophonia in kids and teens. So this paper is really welcome because it helps begin to build that literature. And really, honestly, if we don't have studies done with kids and teens, we're never going to know how misophonia starts. We have to have more and more of these kinds of studies. So I'm really excited that this paper from Dr. Rinaldi and her group is published. The study on the right tells us that how people with misophonia respond emotionally depends on the degree to which they can identify their trigger in the moment. And so this sometimes science tells you the things you already know. And so those of you who experience misophonia, one way or the other, you probably would say, yeah, we already know that, or I already know that, I get it. But we need science to validate what we as people experience for it to be able to be kind of understood better and lead to interventions. Next slide. You can see again, kind of just a variety of different studies. One on the left is looking at kind of different ways to understand the features of misophonia. What are some of its features and how do they hang together? The next one is about kind of looking at pain and sensory overresponsivity in misophonia. This is interesting because there's remarkably little scientific information about how sensory overresponsivity relates to misophonia and how pain relates to misophonia. And intuitively and clinically, we kind of can see how if you have misophonia, you might be at risk for having higher multisensory overresponsivity. Misophonia, you could even think of as kind of a sensory related phenomenon. And so it's kind of striking to me that very few studies have started to look at this correlation, but these folks here over in Israel began to look at this. So this is an interesting study to take a look at. The next one over is Dr. Nekshu, who's part of Duke and our group. She has a review paper about the neurobiology of misophonia. And what Dr. Nekshu is doing is trying to figure out ways that we can understand misophonia in the brain specific to misophonia compared to brains of people who are kind of emotionally dysregulated but don't have misophonia. That's really important because we don't have a whole lot of studies that compare misophonia to kind of clinical control conditions. And until we do that, we really won't know the specifics of what misophonia is relative to other things that are kind of like misophonia adjacent. So Dr. Nekshu's work is really exciting because it kind of helps us move in that direction. Her work also helps us move in the direction of understanding how we can use neurostimulation as a potential intervention for misophonia. The study on the far right is work done by Dr. Hannon and her team at UNLV, and here they're looking at music and misophonia. And I get asked questions very regularly, usually from musicians who have misophonia. They will ask about whether anybody's done any studies looking at misophonia in musicians. And Dr. Hannon's team is the team that is really leading the world in that work. Next, please. Okay, moving maybe a little quicker through this last slide just because of time. Again, you just see kind of a variety of different studies here looking at learning in misophonia. The second one looks at tinnitus and hyperacusis in misophonia and really trying to disentangle those three sound intolerance conditions. The third, from the left to the right, the third study here looks at emotional functioning in misophonia. The final on the far right is a measurement paper that looks at how to take the S5, which is a tool, a self-report tool to measure misophonia, and how to kind of modify it and use it with Mandarin-speaking individuals. Next. The one on the far left, I'll talk a little bit more about in a few slides, so I'm gonna skip that for now. The next one over is from Dr. Heller's team, is kind of like the one I mentioned before. It's a study that looks at how do we identify, how do people with misophonia identify, how do they identify trigger sounds, and to what extent does context influence their ability to recognize their triggers, and does it change, does their ability to recognize their triggers, does that change their reaction to their triggers? And this is, I think, really interesting work that they're doing that I think what we'll talk about in a few minutes has real treatment implications. Dr. Dibb's work over in the UK looked at a longitudinal study of misophonia and emotions. This is important because this is the only study to look over time at what happens in misophonia. This is the only study that has done that has looked from time point 1 to time point X over time, what in the world is happening with people. Until we do that more and more and more, we really won't totally understand misophonia from a kind of scientific perspective. And last here on the far right is another measure development study. This is a screening tool that Zach Williams and his mentor, Dr. Wojnarowski, they have developed in their team kind of a screening tool for misophonia that has really nice psychometric properties. Gosh, there's more. There's so many. This is what's so exciting. There's so much work that's being done. So more about understanding misophonia in the body. Another paper here about understanding a measurement here in German, kind of taking the same S5 tool, but now looking at it in a German sample. A study here on the third study, which is a study from our team, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the fourth study from the far right is just an absolutely terrific study by Heather Hansen and their group, looking in the brains of people with misophonia. And I will talk about that one in just a minute as well. Next, please. Okay, so we talked about the consensus definition. I'm just going to highlight now a couple of papers out of the last year that I think really are especially important. Both Sylvie and I have already mentioned this, so I won't go very deep here, but I just want to say that this paper is the kind of starting point. It's really a new starting point for the world to understand, how do we collectively define what misophonia is? And it might be that this consensus definition, which was derived across a group of an interdisciplinary group of researchers and clinicians, it might be that over time we modify this definition. In fact, I expect it will change over time as the science advances. But what we have that's so exciting is we now have a starting point where every single one of us on this call today, every single one of us can start with the same definition. We can disagree, we can quibble, we can kind of pick at it, but we all are starting from the same place together. And as Sylvie said, that was not the case just a few years ago. In fact, a few years ago, they got us all together in Chicago, a group of us, about 40 of us. And the first thing they did was ask us each to define misophonia, and guess how many different definitions we all came up with? It was about 40. So things have changed quite a bit just in that short amount of time. The particulars of this consensus definition, I just encourage you to take a look at it. It really is also a nice paper in the sense that it functions to review the literature as of its publication. So it also not just gives you a definition, but really tells you about the science of misophonia up until then. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is a study which I mentioned a minute ago that I absolutely love. I will not bore you with all of the particulars of the science in it. It is a very complicated brain imaging study. But what they did that's absolutely fabulous is they looked inside the brains of people with misophonia. And they did this as they were exposing them to particular kinds of triggers. And these triggers were not just simply usual oral or facial triggers. And what they did was they discovered that there's really an underlying neural representation of misophonia that extends beyond oral and facial. That's absolutely, in my mind, I think that's absolutely groundbreaking research. Thank you, Chris, for posting this in the chat. I see you just posted that. Their study says essentially that people with misophonia, when they are observing things like finger tapping, that parts of the brain involved with producing finger tapping start to activate. And this is complicated. It's really complicated stuff, but it essentially is telling us that when people with misophonia are observing their triggers, there are neural processes in their brain that are getting activated that involve their own production of the same behavior. It's almost like a mimicry or a kind of what some people call a motor neuron kind of thing. Mirror neuron kind of thing, where you're kind of reflecting back. It's almost like you have these neurons that see in others and have a mirror up, and you kind of produce the same response. The easiest way I find to describe this is just as my own experience as a parent. When my kids were little, and I don't know if any of you have had this, but when my kids were really little, this where you got to feed them directly. They're sitting in the high chair and you're feeding them. And this might just be me. Maybe I'm over disclosing, but I would go to feed them and I couldn't keep myself from opening my mouth. As they would open their mouth, I would kind of go in and they would open their mouth. And as they would, I would find my mouth would just open up instinctively, reflexively. I couldn't even control it. I mean, I could control it. I could keep my mouth shut. But it was really hard. And it was kind of this automatic empathic thing. And that's an example of this kind of mirror neuron experience that a lot of us have, where we kind of produce the thing that we are experiencing. So Hansen's work, I think, really moves the field forward in telling us there's a lot of complicated stuff happening that's very real. This is an excellent, excellent study from a kind of pure scientific perspective. And I think it really helps move our field forward a bit. Okay, next. Okay, the next study that I'm highlighting is a study that our group did, which we spent multiple years doing. And this is the first large study to look at DSM-5 psychiatric disorders, current and lifetime, in people who at least report having high symptoms of misophonia. So we went through the entire what's called SCID-5, which is just like the structured diagnostic interview, the gold standard, the kind of most rigorous way you can do this. And what we found in a group of 207 people is that anxiety disorders were the most common psychiatric disorders. And it wasn't even close. I mean, it was really quite staggering that 57% of our sample met criteria for a current anxiety disorder. And the most common of the anxiety disorders are listed here: social anxiety, generalized anxiety, and specific phobia. So, if we had time, we can kind of talk some about that. I think it makes sense that social anxiety, generalized anxiety, and specific phobia would be the most common. I won't bore you with the details of it now, but it makes sense that, to me, when I look at the diagnostic symptoms and I know misophonia, I can kind of see very logically, yeah, this would make sense. This would make sense. You can see a lot of it. When we look at the most common lifetime disorders, the most common lifetime disorders were major depression, and then there again, social anxiety and generalized anxiety. So this is the only study that has really looked comprehensively at the question of which mental health problems are most associated with misophonia. This is really, from a DSM-5 perspective, it's the only study that's done that. And it's different than a previous study that was done in Amsterdam that was a larger study, but didn't use the full DSM-5, didn't really look at all disorders. It kind of picked 15 of them and looked at that. Okay, I'm going to move us along, Emily, to the next one, which is the Samermet et al. Paper out of Nick Davidenko's lab at UC Santa Cruz. This is a study where what they did is they had this idea, because they're perception researchers, right? They had this really cool idea that if you present plausible alternative visual context for people's triggers, the plausibly alternative visual context will trick the person's brain, and they won't react to their trigger like they would if they saw the trigger being produced in the way that they would expect it to be produced. The best example of this, and I will not trigger anybody here, but the best example is if you imagine seeing feet stepping on the screen in front of you. You see feet stepping in snow or in leaves or on rocks. You can imagine the sound that stepping in snow, leaves, or rocks will make. And it turns out that sound is actually very similar to the sound of crunching or the sound of sniffling or snorting. And so you can take, and what they did was they took these true triggers and they recorded videos of people making the triggers, and then they recorded videos of plausible alternative visuals to the same trigger sound. And they showed people with misophonia both the actual trigger with an actual visual of it and the trigger sound with an alternative, plausible alternative, they call it. And guess what? Plausible alternative visually incongruent sound reduces reactivity. In other words, the triggers weren't triggering as much. This is, in my mind, absolutely fascinating. Now, we don't know how or in which ways this could translate to a treatment, but you better believe that that's the next step that my group and other groups, including Dr. Davidenko's group, are starting to look at, because this really could represent a vector, an angle in to try to help people with misophonia by changing the way in which they're experiencing being triggered in the moment by altering the visual context of the experience. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to zip through. I promise I want time for Q&A. So what I want to say here is, now, Emily, you can move to the next slide. We've got a couple of slides here talking about advocacy and awareness in this last year. The New York Times article is probably the biggest kind of, I guess, most visible kind of in the media article of 2022. If you haven't read this yet, you can access it. This is, I think that the writer did just a really terrific job writing about misophonia. The BBC News one here on the right, I included to say this is not just something happening in America. This is a BBC News world, and it was written in Spanish. This is an excellent article if you can read Spanish. If not, maybe you can translate it. If you have paid any attention to misophonia in the news, you know that the first ever court case where a family was taking essentially a school system to court over providing accommodations under ADA for misophonia. This is in Tennessee, in Knoxville, Tennessee, and the Charlotte Observer piece here is describing that. Next slide. Podcasts, lots of podcasts. Here's a few of them. I see Dr. McMahon is with us today. She runs a terrific podcast called A Little Help for Our Friends. Give her a shout out. This is she and there she is. There's Kibby in the chat. So Kibby and her colleague, our colleague Jacqueline Trumbull, lead this terrific podcast, and they have an episode on misophonia. We also see there's a few others. The one that probably most people are familiar with in this group is the Misophonia podcast, run by our colleague Adil Ahmad. There's several years worth of misophonia podcasts there to listen to. The best one I think I ever did is the one on the far left. It's probably the only podcast I'm actually happy with. I was happy with how it came out myself. But that's one you can check out. Okay, next slide, Emily. SoQuiet.org. So again, I mentioned at the very beginning, SoQuiet.org is ascending in my mind as really a premier advocacy nonprofit for misophonia. Check out SoQuiet.org. SoQuiet.org is doing terrific things to support people all around the world with misophonia. This is a lean operation that is driven by Chris and a small group of dedicated people. But check out SoQuiet.org. And if you feel so inclined, reach out to Chris and see how you can help. Okay, the last slide here I have before Q&A is what I think are the top 10 ways misophonia advanced in 2022. A lot of this I've already talked about. And so again, the first is that we now have a consensus definition of this very thing we are all here to try to understand and change. And that is really, I think, the most important advancement of the year. We have this special section that I've talked about with, turns out, about 20 to 25% of all scientific studies ever published on misophonia are in that special section. I'll say that again, about a fifth to a quarter of all studies ever done on misophonia came out in this last year and are in the special section that we put out. So lots of recent research. It's just an exciting time to look at scientifically what in the world is misophonia and what do we do about it. Number 4 is that really recognizing how generous and how much money and effort and time has been put in by folks at the Ream Foundation Misophonia Research Fund. And they've awarded directly a little less than $10 million in the last 4 years to investigators. But if you kind of do the math, as I did, in addition, there's a bit more money than that that's been allocated for research that wasn't listed in Sylvie's slide, but is part of other kind of initiatives that they are funding outside of the usual cycle. So I hope that's okay. Beth, I see you're here as well. I hope it's okay to just take liberties and say it's probably just about 10 million. That's a good number, and it's an exciting number, and really just grateful to all of the folks there for their generosity. Number 5, we now have multiple well-validated measurement tools. We had some as of 2021, but as of 2022, we have several more. A few years ago, we didn't have any measures of misophonia that were validated. We now do. We actually have about 4 or 5 of them that are pretty reasonably well validated. And again, that's exciting. That wasn't true a year ago. We have the first ever clinician rating measure. That's the Duke Misophonia interview that our colleague Rachel Guetta is the first author on and led. And this is also something you can get for free. It's out there. It's available. You can Google Duke Misophonia interview. This is a structured clinical interview that researchers and clinicians can use. It's free. It takes about 30 to 45 minutes to do. And if you have questions about it, you can reach out to us. The 7th is this Hansen et al. Paper, which I've gone on and on and on about. I think it's really just one of the top studies of the year. The 8th is the New York Times article, because when you get the New York Times, you get visibility. In fact, one could argue that it wasn't really the research in 2013 that got us on this path to understand misophonia. Could really argue that the breakthrough moment for misophonia came 2 years before, when a New York Times article was put out, the first one on misophonia. That is really, in my mind, what started awareness about all of this. Last, we have our podcasts, social media, entertainment media, increased awareness in 2022 more than in 2021. And number 10 is this conclusion that you can find across multiple studies, which is that context and perception influences how people with misophonia react to their triggers. It's not just the sound itself. It's the sound in context. And that's really important in ways that we don't have time to kind of dive deeply into today. We will in our next webinar, which will be in March. We will talk more about this, but I really think if you go back to that CMER paper, you can see there's ways to think about changing the context of being triggered that can change how one experiences when they are being triggered. And that experience will change their physiological reaction, which potentially can help people be less distressed, less overwhelmed, better able at managing things, and so on. So that's the last conclusion. I'm going to stop. I'm sorry, I have so much to say. I would do these for 2 hours, but I think that would be too long for you guys. But I know I talk fast and I say a lot. I want to just thank you all for listening. And now, Jen, if you want to take us away here with some questions. Let me just say, this is the last thing here is the next webinar is March 21st, and there's the email you can use to register in advance. Jen.
Okay, there's a lot of questions, but about 5 people asked about the DSM and the ICD-11, I guess 12 it'll be, the next DSM. What kind of advocacy has to be done to get misophonia in these diagnostic manuals? Are there any studies being done that can help that? And does anyone think that there will be acceptance into these manuals?
Yeah, I can say a lot. I'll say quickly, though, all of the research that Sylvia and I have talked about today, all of that is informative in kind of supporting an argument for misophonia being a kind of separate condition, different from other things. It's the whole body of research that is used to kind of make those arguments. There are not enough data. There are not enough studies differentiating misophonia from other sound intolerance conditions or psychiatric disorders to warrant, at this point, arguing that it is clearly, scientifically speaking, clearly something different than everything else. That research still there's a lot of research that still needs to be funded and needs to be done to be able to make that argument. The next DSM is scheduled to be published in a few years. I don't think I would expect that as of today, we can argue that misophonia will be in the DSM. There's just a lot more science that needs to be done to get to that point. ICD is a different question. ICD has an easier pathway. The International Classification of Diseases Manual, you can get, I think that's really where we'll see misophonia be first before it is ever in the DSM. And really one has to argue, does it even make sense to consider it as a mental health problem or a psychiatric disorder? We haven't answered that question yet, but we certainly know it's a thing. It's a thing that is worthy of being in the ICD. And I think that you'll see in the next year, there'll be some movement in that direction. No promises, but some of us on this call are working on that.
Okay, another question. Someone asked, they see the term mild misophonia. Have different levels been studied or determined?
There aren't different levels per se, but what you can think of as misophonia is a spectrum or kind of a dimensional kind of phenomenon where someone can have kind of mild, moderate, or severe levels of impairment, occupationally, academically, or socially. And that might be maybe, Danielle, where you're seeing this kind of mild notation. It usually reflects how impaired the person is as a response to having some of their misophonia symptoms.
Okay. People also want, I guess I'll ask this more generally, since a few people alluded to, what kind of treatment do we foresee for misophonia? Also, I want to add to that, maybe you can address both. Does treating anxiety help misophonia?
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots to say here. There are no pharmacological treatments that have any evidence base for misophonia. There are no psychotherapies that have direct, specific evidence as kind of the treatment for misophonia. There are no audiologic interventions that have been subjected to rigorous study and are considered treatments for misophonia. So the short of it is we don't have any evidence-based treatments specifically validated for misophonia. What we do have, though, are evidence-based interventions across audiology, occupational therapy, and psychology or mental health more broadly that target underlying features of misophonia. And anxiety is one of those kinds of underlying features. Anxiety is very common in misophonia. There are evidence-based treatments for anxiety. There's a number of them. And if you target changing anxiety and the biological processes, the psychological processes, the behavioral processes, the cognitive processes, if you target all of those things that relate to anxiety using evidence-based approaches, you can help people with misophonia. But that's a different way of answering it than, is there a specific treatment? There isn't a branded treatment with an acronym that is the treatment, but that doesn't mean we can't help people. It doesn't mean we can't treat people and find benefit. We treat people, and lots of people are being treated in lots of places using kind of, maybe you could think of it as off-label, using off-label kinds of approaches that have not been studied for misophonia, but really are for people and have an evidence base for people who have similar kinds of features as what we expect to see in misophonia. Rumination, hopelessness, shame, anxiety, hypervigilance, escape behavior, avoidance behavior, all of interpersonal kinds of difficulties. All of these kinds of things are things we might expect in any given person to have. Not everybody with misophonia has the same stuff, right? There's a lot of heterogeneity. There's a lot of different presentations, but you can kind of take each person in a very individualized way, help them. And if we had more time, I'd go on and on about a kind of a multidisciplinary approach to doing that, because I really think that's the best way to frame all of this. Not just thinking about mental health or anxiety, but really thinking about it from a broader multidisciplinary perspective.
Someone asked about just specifically biofeedback and sequent repatterning therapy. If you could quickly speak to those.
So biofeedback, you can kind of lump into the broader category of interventions that are long studied to help people with having kind of hyperarousal related problems in their body. So when their physiological arousal is kind of just chronically amped up, you often see biofeedback used for people with pain, and in a way to reduce their autonomic arousal, to basically tamp the brakes and pump the brakes on their nervous system so that their body is calmer. So if you think about biofeedback that way, you could think, okay, for some people with misophonia, that could be one thing to consider. I wouldn't think of that as its own standalone treatment for misophonia. I might think of that more as one potential option in kind of a menu of options for any given person. And sequent repattern therapy is not something that has an evidence base for misophonia, and not something that I would recommend.
Just to be clear, Zach, I think what you're saying in terms of biofeedback and really any intervention is that while there is no particular therapy for misophonia, all of these things can be helpful
Yeah.
when, yeah, done in a sort of coping skills approach or interdisciplinary approach, however you want to put it, and that none of them are a standalone cure, but
right,
all of these things can be of help.
That's exactly right. There, if you're looking for a brand of treatment for misophonia, you're not going to find it. You might find one, but it's not going to have any evidence base for it. Not yet. Not yet. But if instead you're thinking about how do I holistically help this person from a multidisciplinary perspective, using reasonable approaches that have an evidence base behind it, not for misophonia, but for people who experience some of the same features that this person in front of you experiences, then you can tailor. That's a way of thinking. That's a framework. That's not a brand of treatment. That's a framework for how to help somebody holistically. And that can be done.
People are asking, how far away do you think research is from a real treatment, a branded treatment, as you're saying, or something that can guarantee amelioration of this disorder?
Well, I think, there's some research being done. It's a scientific question. It's really a question of how long does science take to yield answers that the public can trust and healthcare providers can trust are appropriate. So it's questions of how long to show something is feasible, acceptable, and likely to help. You got to have those three things. Does it, can it be done? Do people find it reasonably acceptable? And does it show some promise? And there are studies, including some work we're doing in our group and work that others are doing, that are kind of beginning to look at various different cognitive behavioral therapy approaches. And cognitive behavioral therapy is a sort of a family name for a wide variety of different interventions targeting specific processes. And so how long will it take before some of these treatments show that they work? It may not take that long to find some initial data showing it looks like it might be promising, but you have to differentiate that from more convincing science that's larger, that has enough people in it, that has diverse samples, that is done really, really well. That might be, that's probably 5-10 years before those studies are funded. You're talking about, studies that will take usually 4 or 5 years to do and may cost, anywhere from $500,000 to a couple $1 million each to do. It's not trivial to do a study like that. And you need a couple of them to really kind of convincingly show that a particular brand of treatment works. Now, obviously, the more philanthropic funding there is, the more that dollar value is, the faster we can get there. The slower that the science gets done, the longer it will take. But I would say, just generically speaking, we're at least probably 5 years away from being able to say something like that.
2 people are asking about exposure therapy specifically. Is it a no?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of exposure therapy in the usual traditional way, conventionally, where exposure therapy looks like the patient sits there exposing themselves to the thing they're afraid of and just sits there and doesn't do anything, doesn't try to think differently, doesn't try to regulate their emotions, doesn't really do anything other than feel the arousal and distress, with the goal being that they should habituate and it should decrease. I don't recommend that whatsoever for misophonia. There's lots of reasons we could go into why that probably isn't the right approach for misophonia. However, the caveat is that that is really an old way of doing exposure therapy. And the newer ways of doing exposure therapy, which, by the way, is called inhibitory learning-based exposure therapy, inhibitory learning-based exposure. When you do inhibitory learning-based exposure, you actually don't have the person just sit there and kind of take it. Instead, you have them control and kind of change the context in which they are approaching the thing that they are avoiding, typically. And that actually is a part of what looks like might be promising in some of the evidence, or kind of emerging evidence around possible treatments for misophonia. So it's a little subtle, and we don't have time to get into any more details about it, but generically speaking, if a clinician says, I want to do exposure therapy, what I want you as a parent or as a person to ask is, are you planning conventional exposure therapy? Or are you talking about inhibitory learning-based, newer, more modern exposure therapy? And if the clinician says, I don't really know, what's the difference? I think that's probably all you need to know. You probably want to move on. If the clinician says, I'm going to do traditional exposure therapy, you probably are not going to want it. I mean, the data suggests, there's a study that just came out suggesting that exposure therapy is the least desired therapy for people with misophonia. This is the one they rank the lowest. Treatments don't work if patients won't do them, right? So just at that basic level, if the therapist or clinician wants to do a traditional exposure therapy, it's just highly unlikely that a person with misophonia is going to want to do it or be willing to do it. But if they say, I'm trained in exposure therapies, and there's an inhibitory learning approach that we can gradually get to that won't involve exposing you to your triggers, but will involve helping you learn to approach those contexts that you're avoiding that are causing you problems, where I'm going to help you do some things differently, maybe use some skills to cope and kind of react and manage things differently. That, I would say, is promising.
I think it's important, Zach, just to make it clear that if this has been studied, it's confusing to people, the difference of inhibitory learning, exposure therapy versus exposure therapy. I think,
I know. It's a very insider thing to say. I realize that I'm saying it's very insider. It's very sort of jargony. I know this, but it's the reality is that traditional exposure, no. Newer exposure, maybe.
But we don't really know you can't say for sure. I'm just concerned people will go out there and.
No, you can't say for sure for anything yet. So the question isn't, can we say for sure? The question is, what seems reasonable from an evidence-based standpoint? What's a candidate reasonable thing to consider as part of a broader suite of treatment approaches? And it turns out there's a lot of things that are reasonable to consider that you want to map onto that individual person in a way that's very, very flexibly tailored to what they need.
And someone is asking also about trauma therapies, if there's any trauma therapies that may also work.
So there aren't any studies, again, go back to studies, there's no science suggesting any trauma-specific therapies work for misophonia. There's actually not any science showing that misophonia is related to the diagnosis of PTSD beyond what you would expect in a kind of the base rate of the population. So I know that there's an earlier study that asked people, hey, do you have PTSD or not? And in that study, the diagnosis when self-reported was correlated with misophonia. That's not actually how you diagnose people. if you do it the way that it's really needing to be done, where you kind of carefully do it really rigorously, those studies that have done that have not really found PTSD to be related. And the thing you have to remember about trauma is that most people have a trauma history. Almost everybody here on this call has had a trauma happen to them or will in their lifetime. Trauma is unfortunately very, very normal for humans. So we can't associate trauma per se with misophonia just because some people with misophonia have trauma. Otherwise, we would say we should associate everything with trauma, because really all patients who show up for all treatments are likely to have a history of trauma, because all people are likely to have that history.
There are so many more questions, Zach, but I don't want to miss this one.
I'm willing to keep going.
Okay, an earlier one, someone had asked, and I think this is important, obviously, they're all important. I'm trying to kind of crunch them into sort of categories. What are your thoughts and what is known in the field about the correlation of ASD and misophonia?
So autism spectrum disorder, in our data, we have some preliminary data showing there's a correlation between autism spectrum symptoms and misophonia symptoms. The correlation, we haven't published on this yet. The correlation is significant, but it's small. So it's sort of like there's a relationship, but it's not like, if you imagine two circles overlapping, there's a little bit of overlap, but it's not a lot. It's not like they're the same thing. Conceptually, the way you can think about it is that there's a part of autism spectrum disorder that is like a part of misophonia, but all of autism spectrum is not like misophonia. And the part that's like misophonia, in my opinion, is really the part that involves the sensory defensiveness that we see in autism spectrum. But the other parts of autism spectrum are not the kinds of things we typically see in misophonia. We don't see circumscribed. We don't see circumscribed interests in misophonia. That's not a misophonia thing. That's a defining characteristic of autism, but that's not something we see in misophonia. We don't see this sort of language development and social problems in autism. We don't see that in misophonia. What we do see that connects those two dots together is the sensory part, the sensory defensiveness piece.
Also, a number of people asked about misophonia being genetic or inherited.
Again, no data pointing to whether it's inherited. There's reason to think, though, logically, that like many other things, there's probably some genetic heritability component. But like most other things in the world of kind of behaviors and emotions and patterns and diagnoses, there's actually a much stronger relationship between learning and what happens when the person is born, between that and the diagnosis, than there is just simply thinking about their genes. The more complicated answer is that our genes interact with our environment, and our environment interacts with our genes. You can think about the way we experience life as having moments or times where buttons are pressed on our genes that activate our genes, and then how our biology is expressed, how it's expressed, impacts the environment around us. And so you have this kind of transactional back and forth thing happening from birth to death for all of us. And so you can kind of generically think about misophonia that way, because that's how you can think about most things. What I wouldn't think is that there is a particular gene specific to misophonia, because there really isn't a particular gene specific to almost anything, and arguably to anything related to mental health.
Couple more questions. Is it possible to outgrow misophonia? And also, so this is kind of related, well, not really, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Why do some people go through therapy and their misophonia is resolved, whereas others aren't?
If you think about misophonia from a spectrum perspective, mild, moderate, severe, and you think about misophonia as something that can occur in any given person side by side any number of other kinds of presenting problems, right? It doesn't, sometimes it occurs by itself. Sometimes it occurs with autism. Sometimes it occurs with an anxiety disorder. Sometimes it occurs with hyperacusis, an audiologic condition. Sometimes it occurs with all sorts of different things. So you kind of think about people with misophonia are not all the same. When they start any given treatment, they're all starting from a different and very unique starting point. They're bringing their own unique background, their own unique biology, their own lack of or presence of other kinds of problems. And so when you start there and you think about it that way, the question gets naturally answered, I think, which is that people who come into treatment with fewer complications and less impairment are probably more likely to do better in treatment. They're probably more likely to benefit. It's probably a little bit easier. I've had patients who, fit that bill, and really all I do with them in some examples is just a lot of support and education and validation and empowerment, and help them kind of think about what they can do differently to cope more effectively. And they tell me they're feeling like they can better manage their misophonia and they're good to go. Those are the easier people to help. But the point is there's easier, there's more moderate, and there's more complicated and severe. So some people are going to get better through evidence-based interventions that target underlying problems that make misophonia worse. If you have misophonia and you have, let's say, panic disorder, and you come to therapy and you receive treatment for panic disorder that's evidence-based, and it works, and you no longer have panic disorder, there's every reason to believe that your misophonia severity should go down with it. It should go down with it. If the treatment's done well, probably impairment and symptoms related to misophonia will also go down a bit. Now, they won't necessarily go away, but they might go down. So I think, Jen, it's a great question. It's complicated because you can kind of come at it from different angles.
Hey, Zach, can we have one participant ask a question? He's been asking if he can directly ask the question.
Sure, of course.
I'm partial. Okay. If you're still on, Sean, if you could go ahead and unmute and you can ask your question.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. So first off, very much appreciate the work y'all are doing. Obviously, quantitative data is kind of the bread and butter of clinical research. I'm curious if there are venues for folks to share their qualitative experiences. As somebody who's had misophonia for 20 years, I've done a lot of theorizing and thinking about the causes of things, and examples like the mirror neuron component, that's been a part of how I've described this to people for 15 years, and the idea of context and how that affects triggers and perception. So I really think if there's a mechanism for mining people's qualitative experiences, that could really seed ideas about new studies to take place. And I've got a related question too.
I love, Sean, everything you just said. I love all of it. I mean, I think you're exactly right. We don't have, there is no online platform worldwide to collect in a systematic way qualitative experiences and then kind of collate them and aggregate them and make sense of them. But that is a fabulous idea, and something that I've talked to some different groups in the world about trying to orchestrate. It doesn't exist yet, but I absolutely love the idea.
Certainly, Zach, someone could do a qualitative study.
Of course.
Rather, so Sean, you probably know this, but there are qualitative studies. So that would be a study where instead of using quantitative measures, you ask people, obviously sufferers, what they think, and you sort of develop themes around that and a narrative around that. It's really great for this kind of disorder that's not well understood. And I think, Sean, I just want to say I think it's a great point.
It's a really good point. And Jen, you're right. I mean, I'm helping a graduate student, not at Duke, but at another university, do exactly that. She's doing for her her master's thesis. She's doing a qualitative study on trying to understand misophonia through interviewing people with it to kind of get at the richness and complexity of it qualitatively instead of quantitatively. And I'm helping her with that. And any scientist can do that. It's just a matter of funding and time. It's a matter of interest, time, and funding, but it's a great idea, Sean.
A very quick follow-up to that. I do a lot of research as part of my work, obviously not clinical research or health related, but it would be really interesting if we have a community of folks, as folks that are on this call that do experience it, that we could reach out to each other and kind of do amateur research of, let me collect these qualitative things, let me run it through this system as another way to sort of seed ideas.
I love it. And that's where I thought your brain was going a few minutes ago, which is kind of why I reacted the way I did to you, that infrastructure does not exist. But if you want to make it with me, contact me and we'll see if we can connect the dots and connect people together who would want to do such a thing. I absolutely love the idea. I love it. And
Awesome.
again, talk to some people about trying to orchestrate it. I've talked to people about that in the context of an app, but we haven't built the app. It's complicated to build an app. It takes time and money to do it. We never did it. But I think it's just an absolutely terrific idea.
Thank you.
One question that I missed that was asked earlier is there any research on highly sensitive people and misophonia?
Yes, although there's not a lot of it. It kind of depends on how you define highly sensitive people. There's people that study that as kind of a primary thing that they're interested in. Yes, the short answer is yes, that you can think about whenever, I'll just say it this way, when I meet someone with misophonia, which is very regularly, it's usually almost daily, as I'm learning about their history, I am already anticipating that they're going to tell me something along the lines of how aware they are of others, how empathic they are, how sensitive, how attuned they are, how kind of careful they are in noticing things, not just misophonia related triggers and cues, but really kind of their attentional systems are often very sharpened. Their antennae are often very long and very, very sensitive. I think empathy as a general kind of thing, empathy likely correlates with misophonia severity.
And also, Zach, just sorry to interrupt you, but
No,
this
no,
person
please.
is also pointing out high sensory processing. So I guess sensory overresponsivity.
Yep. That's the study I pointed out earlier in Israel. That group looked at that. We have some data that we're looking at where we're finding a correlation between sensory overresponsivity across different sensory domains and misophonia symptoms. It shouldn't be surprising. I mean, you would expect these things to be correlated.
Someone also asked if the potential effects of ADHD drugs, I guess, I don't know, are you asking specifically stimulants? Let's make that assumption for now. If stimulants can actually make misophonia worse.
Well, I have had some patients tell me that. I had a patient recently say, why did they give me a stimulant? Isn't that going to make me more kind of, wired? Why would I want to be more wired? Yeah. I don't know that answers the question other than to say, yeah, I can't dispense medical advice. I'm not a physician and I wouldn't do that anyway, even if I was a physician on a webinar, but you can use your logic to kind of say, yeah, if something is a stimulant and the person is if the stimulant functions to enhance stimulation rather than sort of zero in and have someone focus, it could put them more at risk for being overstimulated. If it also helped sharpen their focus and their focus now is even more sharpened in on potential triggers, that could, of course, make things worse. That could lead to a hypervigilance. And that's, attentionally speaking, probably part of what is kind of under the hood, if you will, of a lot of people with misophonia.
Having said that, I just want to add that there are ADHD medications that are not stimulants. I just asked the question to Zach about stimulants because stimulants, of course, are the main ADHD medication.
Yeah.
Okay. Zach, if I could, I just wanted to answer the question about misokinesia, which also was asked. And if it's okay, I'll just answer it. So misokinesia was originally termed by Schroeder and his group in Amsterdam, and he originally meant being triggered by watching movement. So somebody jiggling their leg, something like that. It came to be that misokinesia started to be a term for all of the visual triggers. So it may be that there are visual triggers, and I think this is probably true, that are associated with sounds that are aversive. And there may also be visual triggers based on sort of watching these repetitive movements. Someone is also saying, I've also experienced misophonia for repetitive, strong smells.
Mhm. Yeah, again, think about each sensory domain, smell and touch and taste and visual and auditory. And someone can be very sensitive, not so sensitive, or undersensitive to any or all of those different sensory domains. And, you know, we live in a multi-sensory world. We don't live in a unisensory world. So you might expect that if you're kind of sensitive to one of those sensory domains, you might be more likely to be sensitive to at least one of the others. So we often see clinically, it's very, very normal clinically for me when I'm working with patients or talking to family members to hear that it's not just sound, it's really kind of visual, or it's smell, or it's touch, or it's different people, it's different things. But the sensory over-responsivity is really, in my experience clinically, very, very kind of expected.
And another question, just in the audiological realm, or I guess apropos to misophonia in general, what is better, ear sound devices or headphones to block sound?
Yeah, it's a great question too. So there's not any kind of science to answer that question at this point. What I recommend, similar to what you've heard me talking about throughout this Q&A, the last 40 minutes or so, is that each person might really have their own different response, and you want to create for each person kind of a suite, a menu, a set, a toolbox, if you will, of approaches that they will use, that they find helpful. So from that perspective, from a very pragmatic perspective, I usually recommend that patients and families, that they consider an evaluation and treatment recommendations from an audiologist. And then in that conversation with the audiologist, that's where they can look at, gosh, here are the different options for sound masking devices. Here are the different products. Here are the price points. Here's how they fit. You know, here's kind of what it takes to do this. And the reality is each person responds differently to those different options. Some patients love them. Some patients hate them. Some patients find them meh. You know, some people like them a little bit and then they don't like them at all. Misophonia in my house, which we have misophonia in my house, misophonia looks like people wearing headphones as distraction and masking, not sound devices. But lots of patients I've known use sound devices and maybe don't use headphones, or maybe they use both in different contexts, use one or the other.
Lisa, do you see any questions that I may have missed? Or Chris, anyone?
Yeah, I'm trying to see. I think someone did ask me about, I mean, it goes along with all the therapy. We didn't talk about DBT. Someone asked me if DBT and, you know, the regulation skills that are taught, could those be helpful? And as we kind of keep saying, Zach, is, you know, for some person, you know, for some people it would be helpful, and other people, if they're, and again, doing the work, you know, if we're willing to put in the work, some of the skills that can help with, you know, regulating the emotions that may come about with triggers. I mean, you know, it's not going to hurt to know some of those skills
That's right.
when you're activated. So
Yeah, I mean, that's another example. It's not to get too jargony. We're long past our planned stop time, and I'm happy to answer all these questions and go as long as people want to go here. But DBT is a psychotherapy that is chock full of many, like hundreds of different skills to regulate emotion, to tolerate distress, to be mindful, to be better interpersonally with people. It's just like a big cheesecake factory menu full of skills and tools. And these are not things that are uniquely needed for one diagnosis or one type of person. They're really just life skills that anybody could benefit from, in my opinion, including people with misophonia. So DBT skills are probably valuable for misophonia in the sense that they're probably valuable for most people because they're really just good life skills. So that doesn't mean that somebody with misophonia should do all of DBT. It means that maybe they could benefit from the skills part of DBT, just the skills part. They may not need all of DBT. DBT is a big, heavy treatment, long, it's complicated. It's not for misophonia per se, but the skills part of DBT, which is one of the parts of it, the skills part certainly could be helpful for some people.
Jennifer, do you recall someone asking the question about, because we always talk about, when does misophonia start to arise? Is it young child? I remember someone pointing out, actually, no, for me, it wasn't as a child. It was more late teenage years to like late 20s. And then I think someone now is talking about, the progression. Is it get worse as you get older?
Thank you.
So Zach, are people, I mean, I know longitudinal, we don't have these kind of studies, and then catching people right as it's developing and then following them through their life.
Right. We don't have that.
Like, do you have any sense of people at least studying when we keep saying on average, I know 12 to 4, a lot of 12 to 14 seems to be, or 8, we've heard 8, we heard younger. Jennifer was definitely met some younger people.
Yes.
So again, I don't think there's the data on this.
Yeah, good.
Go
ahead,
sorry.
Jen. No, Jen, you can take it. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, since I work with children a lot with misophonia, I find that there are clinically and anecdotally speaking, very young children, perhaps even toddlers. My own toddler, who's now 28, was showing symptoms. But the only reason I knew they were symptoms, and the disorder wasn't even named yet, we were thinking of it more as auditory overresponsivity. But the reason I knew she had symptoms is because I also have misophonia. So what do you tell a parent to look for? It's really difficult. We don't really know. And you can't ask a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. Maybe you can start beginning to ask a 3-year-old what they're experiencing. So what we have really are self-reports or data based on really, when did you first feel or experience what we know as misophonia? And that entails really aspects of memory that we don't really know that much about. So what people are recalling is when they remember first having misophonia, and hopefully the research will start to go toward more longitudinal research, early identification, but it is the harder research to do, I think. Wouldn't you? Do you agree with
Totally
that?
agree. Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said, Jen. It's complicated. It's hard to do. It takes a long time to really do that well, because you've got to get people measured when they're young, and then over time see what happens. And that takes time. It takes years to get the answers. If you just simply ask somebody, hey, how old were you? As I'm seeing in the Zoom chat, you get a window. You kind of get a peek into what might be happening, but it's really not. It's just not as valid as sort of doing it in real time, because for lots of reasons that are probably obvious, sometimes what people say isn't always accurate. It's sort of like you might think a certain age is the right, but it's not. That doesn't mean that is the age it actually started. It might be that it started a little bit sooner. You know, it's just a little bit tricky from a scientific perspective.
Memory is
isn't perfect, right? As
unreliable.
I'm watching the chat now, as Kevin just said, memory isn't perfect either.
It's
Exactly.
unreliable.
That's the point. It's kind of
And the,
unreliable.
and the other part, if I may, that Lisa mentioned was, does misophonia get worse with age?
Well, there's no longitudinal studies. There's not even really any studies looking at aging in misophonia. So we don't know scientifically. There's reason to believe that in general, we might see emotional reactivity start to tamp down a bit. You know, as we age, we get a little bit calmer as a whole, not every single person, right? But in general, people, as we age, our emotions get a little bit easier to regulate. They'll be a little bit less intense compared to when we're, say, teenagers or young adults, where we're a little bit more reactive, a little bit more likely to kind of have stronger unmodulated emotions. So that's like a general thing to think about emotion regulation and aging. That's not specific to misophonia. That's just kind of people in general, on average, might get a little bit less reactive, less intense. I've certainly had lots of people tell me, gosh, you know, as I've gotten older, I don't react as much. Thank goodness for aging. I had somebody tell me the other day, thank goodness for aging and for my hearing getting worse. You know, I mean, they were being playful, but the point is that ordinary aging in some ways might make things just a little bit more tolerable in some regards. The other thing with aging is that we do in general oftentimes develop naturally through life. We learn, right? We adapt and we learn as humans. And so we pick up ways of doing things that are a little bit better than they used to be, right? We learn to cope. And some people do this through therapy. Some people do this kind of just through life. They learn to cope. Yeah, Kevin, exactly. You learn better habits. You learn healthy habits. You learn how to regulate your arousal system with wellness things that are good for everybody, which also are probably good for reducing the kind of intensity of misophonia, right? Sleep and diet and exercise and all of the things that we often hear about as being good wellness activities. There's every reason to believe those things are probably also helpful to kind of take the edge off of misophonia. Not as a cure. There's no cures for anything. They're like, I got type 1 diabetes. There's no cure for that either. There's no cures for things. There are treatments and there are interventions. There are things that can help. You're not going to cure misophonia. And some of the stuff you can do to self-care and self-management kind of functions like your own coping skills interventions. And I think a lot of people do that as they age, and it can help them. But Kevin's point about, or avoid the triggers, lots of people that I talk to, that's what they'll tell me. They'll say, I'm doing okay, but I don't go anywhere. I don't do anything. I don't leave the house, but I'm doing okay. And, there's no judgment certainly from me, nor should there be from anyone about that person. It's really just kind of for them to figure out how they value living their life and what's really going to be adaptive and best for them. Some people are okay being a little bit more alone. Some people really can't stand being alone, right? I mean, we're all different. And so you got to kind of think about it from that perspective to think through what's really going to be adaptive over time. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a balance of quality of life and right, like you said, whether or not you want to be alone or, around less people, maybe less involved. And so it's tough.
Yeah. And Megan's point there, avoidance is so helpful for misophonia, but definitely negatively affects other aspects. It's right on. It's so right on, Megan. And, again, it's sort of like this question of when is avoidance skillful? When is it unskillful? That to me is the kind of detailed question to sort through with every, patient and family member I work with. It's figuring out contexts, people, places, things, internal experiences that actually are okay to avoid because there's not any significant consequence or its values consistent to avoid. And it's okay. Whereas other contexts, people, places, things, and internal experiences, avoidance comes with a huge cost. So the idea that avoidance is always bad or is always good, I think that's a false dichotomy. I think that's not the way to think about it. I really think it's the shades of gray in the middle where you got to think, when is it helpful and when is it unhelpful? And of course, try to do it only when it's helpful and minimize the times when it's unhelpful. Okay, any other questions? I know we're petering out. We got 39 people out of our 70 something that started, but I love having this conversation with you all. I'm really appreciating everybody's participation and engagement. I know we're way over time, but that's how we do it sometimes here at Duke CMER. We're here to help you guys and kind of have a dialogue. So, any last questions? Anything else? Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sylvie. Thanks for hanging in here with us this whole time through the Q&A. I hope this was valuable for you.
So wonderful to see. This has just been so valuable. Thank you, everyone, for including me.
Thank you. And thanks again to everybody for being here, and especially to Jen for moderating, to Emily for making our slides, and for Lisa for moderating and helping on the back end as well. Thanks, everybody. Our next webinar is March 21st in the new year. We'll see you all then, and everybody be safe and have a really good, smooth and healthy transition into this next year. Take care, everyone.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording.
Sounds good.